Information Officer for Transport for the North. I want to give a particular welcome to our speakers and to any new attendees who are coming for the first time. So we organise these events quarterly, and it's a great opportunity to bring together academics and policymakers to discuss the latest research and key transport-related issues. Just a quick note, you'll find the articles discussed today shortly on our Northern Evidence Hub, which is where both our team at TFN and anybody who signs up can link to the latest evidence on transport and other related topics, along with a short summary. We already have 161 resources available there, I believe, and counting. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Karen Lucas, Professor of Human Geography and Director of Research at the Department of Geography at the University of Manchester, Jiang, Research and Training Fellow at the Institute of Transport Studies, University of Leeds, and also Joe McTigue, Senior Economist at Northern Trains Limited. Just a couple of points to make before I kick off with my slides and a quick introduction to what we've been doing at Transport for the North. As the speakers are already aware, this session is being recorded, so those who are not able to attend today or who have to jump off during this session can watch back later. We'll also be sharing clips from this session on social media later on. And for any audience members, you should be able to ask questions during the session using the Q&A function, and we'll try to cover as many of these as we can. If we're not able to cover all of them, I'm sure we can follow up later by email. So just to kick us off on this session on the impact of transport on people and communities, I just wanted to give a flavour of how at TFN we've been developing our revised strategic transport plan, which is due to be published in 2024. And how this will be informed by our growing understanding of the impacts of the transport system, both positive and negative, on people and places across the North. Our approach is strongly grounded in the evidence that we've been building the past few years, and informed, and including our recently published report on transport-related social exclusion, which is what I'll mainly focus on today, and lots of other work which some of you will be aware of, including our analytical framework, our future travel scenarios, decarbonisation strategy, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure framework. Drawing on this rich body of work allows us to be more specific in our vision than in our initial strategic transport plan in 2019, and give much more detailed considerations to how transport impacts different places and demographic groups differently, to inform the strategic vision that we've developed with our members for the North, and our recommendations. And this will allow us to further strengthen our strategic vision for transport across the North of England, support our local strategies, and articulate the North's priorities with one voice, whilst recognising that locally designed solutions are needed and tailored to local needs and concerns. As I said, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the research we published last week on transport-related social exclusion, which I would strongly encourage you all to have a look at if you haven't done so already. This piece of work was informed by a combination of quantitative and qualitative evidence, including bespoke surveys, interviews and focus groups. And our headline finding was that 3.3 million people in the North of England, or just over a fifth of the population, live in areas where there is high risk of social exclusion because of issues with the transport system. And this is based on neighbourhood level analysis of population vulnerability and transport accessibility. Vulnerability is looking at things like car ownership, levels of deprivation, and other things. Accessibility is about access to key opportunities and services, including the gap between accessibility by public transport and by car. And whilst there are, as you see in the chart on the right, there are regions where transport accessibility is worse than in the north, for example, the southwest, largely because the population is more dispersed and rural than in the north. We found that levels of vulnerability to transport-related social exclusion are higher in the north than elsewhere. And when combining vulnerability and accessibility, this means overall levels of risk to transport-related social exclusion are higher in the north than anywhere else in the country overall. And digging down into the detail, we found that the worst affected areas tend to be areas classed as rural, town and fringe and urban minor conurbations, with places like Hartlepool, Copeland, Blackpool, and so on, experiencing some of the highest levels of TRSE risk of anywhere in the country. We also found that the coastal areas are affected twice as much as non-coastal areas on average, and we found particularly high levels of risk in the northeast in particular. The report also found that experience of transport-related exclusion depends on gender, age, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. It highlighted, for instance, that low-income and disabled people are much less likely to have access to a car, with significant consequences on opportunities and services that they can access. For this and other reasons, both disabled and low-income people are likely to experience higher vulnerability, but we also found that ethnicity, gender and disability status were important determinants of constrained access to public transport as well, as you see in the charts on the right, using the example of ethnicity across a wide range of areas, including boarding public transport, including impacts of road traffic congestion and so on. I would say, however, it's only through interviews with transport users themselves that we were really able to bring to life the barriers that people in the north of England are experiencing to life due to inadequate transport, and that make a powerful case for change. I've included some quotes on this slide from interviewees highlighting the issues faced by residents trying to access work or hospital appointments, or trying to navigate the transport system with young children. But these quotes really only scratch the surface. The interview evidence and analysis of the survey data really bring home the essential role that transport can play in enabling a fulfilling and successful life, but also how for many people it can unfortunately become a significant barrier due to a combination of high cost, poor reliability, low frequency and long journey times. And it was particularly clear how reductions in bus service levels over the past decade have had a major negative impact, given that bus is by far the most frequently used transport mode overall, and in most places the only realistic option available for many journeys for anyone without access to a car. In addition to this, just to give you a flavour of some of the other work that's informing as part of the evidence base behind the strategic transport plan, I wanted to touch on TfN's earlier work on our decarbonisation strategy, which includes a surface transport emissions reduction pathway that's been agreed across the north, and a set of priorities on how to get there. And it's really a three-part focus on transforming the north's economy by closing the productivity gap with the rest of England, which is really a key cornerstone of the initial Northern Powerhouse vision. That was one of the reasons why Transport for the North was founded in the first place. Alongside this, decarbonising the North's transport system, and crucially building a more inclusive transport system that shapes the overall structure of our revised strategic transport plan. Our carbon emissions modelling also includes place-based analysis, recognising that decarbonisation will look different for different places and require different interventions. Just to give you a snapshot of this, as you see in the maps on the right, Some areas have much higher baseline emissions than others. This is partly due to the profile of journeys in different areas. For instance, Richmondshire has higher emissions per head of population, partly due to the longer distances people need to travel to get to places in this highly rural district. But other places face the opposite problem, with low per capita CO2 emissions, but higher emissions intensity per vehicle kilometre due to the prevalence of highly polluting vehicles and other factors. Our decarbonisation strategy also recognises the importance of shifting transport demand from private car towards public transport and active travel as a key lever to achieve decarbonisation alongside technological solutions. But what this looks like in practice will vary significantly between different parts of the north, for different people and for different types of trips, and this needs to be taken into account whenever designing interventions. For instance, we see that 65% of trips are under 5 miles. We also find that cars are particularly dominant for medium-length trips, which can be some of the most challenging trips to shift to other modes. But these medium-length trips also make up the lion's share of vehicle miles, so lots of challenges that need to be considered. Finally, I don't want to take up too much time because we have 3 great speakers for you, but this page shows some of the key priorities identified both in our decarbonisation work and through our work on socially inclusive transport and building on the transport-related social exclusion research that's just been published. Putting these 2 sets of key priorities alongside each other shows a lot of this is complementary, and the strategic transport plan is really shaped by the principle that a socially inclusive shift to net zero for transport is both vital and necessary. All of this prior work will inform TfN's, or is informing TfN's revised strategic transport plan, setting a high level of ambition at the pan-northern level, identifying what kinds of changes are needed and for different kinds of places, and also setting out how TfN can support local transport authority members and also national government to make this happen. Recognise it's been a very brief snapshot of some of the insights feeding into our strategic transport plan, which only really scratches the surface. As you see, a key focus of the SDP is really better understanding the ways that improved transport can improve the lives of North residents. Beyond the slight improvements in journey times that have sometimes been the main concern of transport planning. And all 3 of today's speakers have some fascinating things to say around this topic. So I will stop sharing, and I will welcome Karen Lucas first to start presenting on this topic.
Thank you for that introduction there, Jack. That's really interesting, especially to see the way in which you're linking up different agendas and considering the embedded social inclusion implications of things other than transport equity. You know, thinking about equity within the just transition to decarbonise the transport system is really important, I think. So often those 2 agendas are siloed from each other, and I think we need to be doing a much better job of joining up. Also, really nice to see the complementary qualitative and quantitative data that you're using to match this up as well. I think that's really a novel approach. So thanks very much. Do I have rights to share? I think
yes,
so.
You do. Yeah.
So can you see that? Are you able to see that?
Yes, absolutely. I've got that, Karen. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So basically, I'm just going to talk to you about some work that we've been doing to look at transport and equity and transport-related social exclusion with colleagues at the University of Manchester in the School of Geography, also in the Manchester Urban Institute, and also in my previous employment at the University of Leeds as well. So this has been a long-standing ambition to raise this agenda within policy circles, and it's great to see Transport for the North taking it so seriously. So I think it would be fair to say that and I don't want to spend too much time on this background, but it would be fair to say that previously there's been a big emphasis on the economic aspects of transport, particularly journey time savings and the contribution to the economy. There's also been increasing measures to think about the environmental and the climate impacts of transport, but the social dimension of transport is often not really recognised, although this is becoming more and more prevalent within both academic and policy circles. I think partly the problem is that there's not perhaps a good set of methods for doing this, but also it might be that politicians and decision makers place a greater emphasis on the economic role of transport. So you think about the Northern Powerhouse, and there's an awful lot there about how transport will prop up the economy, but often not so much around the social issues and how transport affects local communities. So that's perhaps a reason behind this. When I'm talking about social impacts, what do I mean? I mean, it basically means anything that affects positively or negatively the behaviours and preferences and choices of different groups of people. Can be both behavioural and cognitive, and these things can be both objective physical issues, but also more subjective issues around well-being and acceptability. And this is quite important when we're thinking about what transport choices we give people, because it's not only what you can do, but what you're willing to do. When we're thinking about the distributional impacts, we're thinking about, well, okay, how do the different interventions that we introduce, how do they benefit or disbenefit different places, so spatially different areas, or over time, how that affects different people over time, or during different times of the day or night, but also quite often, most importantly, the socio-demographic distributions, and particularly here Jack was pointing out that we know that the transport excluded tend to be younger people and older people, lower income groups, often women trying to do multiple trips with children or other caring trips. We also know that those groups of people and places often are repeatedly affected by the negative impacts of the transport system, and that there are interaction effects between the transport system and other indicators of deprivation. For example, areas that have very poor transport links often have much lower house prices, particularly in low-income estates around the edges of cities. That's not to say that there isn't an interaction between all these effects. So when we're thinking about the distribution of transport, we want to be thinking not only about the social impacts like accessibility and safety and air quality, but also around the economic impacts. So who benefits from new transport systems? It's no good putting in new buses and spending a huge amount of money on your bus strategy if all you're doing is serving the same populations that are already highly benefiting from the existing transport system. So we have to think about who benefits from new interventions, as well as who is disbenefiting from the current transport system. For example, in terms of people who are highly vulnerable, also relying on walking, and therefore more exposed to noise and air quality problems. So the work that we've been doing, which is around this social and distributional appraisal, aims to measure the impacts of transport interventions on different groups of people in different places, both in terms of the negative impacts, but also in terms of the positive impacts. This is the definition of the Department for Transport's social and distributional impact assessment. And they find that if we do this, we should improve the efficiency of the overall system. I think that is true if we could actually think about the social and distributional impacts of future transport systems and future policies, that we would improve the efficiency. But I think that we also, in terms of thinking about transport-related social exclusion, need to think about the legacy of the existing system and about actively addressing or restorative justice for the people that currently do not have. So often what we need to be thinking about is how we direct the new policies and the new measures towards those most disadvantaged communities. And that's not always easy to do, either practically or politically, because introducing new transport systems in hard to reach places is much more expensive and often requires subsidy measures to be put in place, which aren't popular with government. And also it's quite difficult politically to justify concentrating interventions in certain areas and not spreading them equally across the whole of an area, for example, because people will then start complaining about the fact that certain groups are getting preferential treatment. So it's quite difficult an act to deliver in practice. But I think if we think about the principles of transport justice and we start to think about using the language of transport justice as a way to develop new systems that are more inclusive and equitable, then we can think about the fact that we can argue that what we're trying to do is develop social progress, so that we have a focus on people's livelihoods, we have a focus on people's health and well-being, and we have a focus on the way in which, of course, these different measures are distributed currently, and how we would like to see them being more equally distributed. And therefore, we have a justification for a redistribution of both the benefits and the costs, and thinking about equality of direct and indirect opportunities, so that we have this framework for socially just appraisal based on a notion of social progress and social justice. And I think a lot of people find that it's resonant when you start talking about fairness. People do understand the language of fairness. I think you also have to think, when you're measuring the outcomes of different policy decisions and the current system, you have to think about people-centered. So start with the people, start with what they need to support their livelihoods. And that's not just employment, but also thinking about access to education and healthcare, to shops and markets, to community activities. So it's much wider than the sort of commuter-focused tendency of current policy. And thinking about whether you want equality in provision, should everybody have the same amount of transport, or equality of outcome? Everybody should be able to do the same things through the transport system, achieve the same levels of accessibility. So it's not necessarily about having the same number of buses, but having the same level of access to the services. And I think most importantly for policymakers, and this is where the qualitative research becomes really important, is that we should be catering for people's actual needs and not what you think they are to be or what you suppose them to be. So often we see policymakers prioritising, for example, access to employment for job seekers, but not necessarily thinking about where those job seekers can actually take up employment that's suited to their skills. So we have to have quite fine level analysis and also a much better qualitative understanding of what people actually need to do and where they actually need to go, rather than just thinking that we understand that through desk-based analysis. And I think it has to be a whole system analysis. We can't just look at individual projects, but we have to look at how projects incrementally interact with the existing transport and land use system to improve those types of social progress outcomes. So can more people get to jobs might not just be a function of the transport system, but also a function of the employment and land use system as well. When we're talking about lower income populations, we quite often have to think about a hierarchy of a priori contextual situation. So we know that poorer people, poorer populations tend to be located in the most inaccessible areas. And this issue around housing and the links between housing affordability, housing location and transport are almost the first layer. Although this is out with the remit of Transport for the North, it's important to be working with the local districts and the combined authorities to be thinking about how transport is located according to housing, and where housing is located according to the local opportunities for people to take up employment. So far too often do we see low-income housing being placed in far too difficult to reach places with poor transport systems, and there is a very important land use planning function here. Which means that mobility options are limited, and if people have low car ownership, then basically they have very difficult transport connectivity journeys, and this was coming out through some of the qualitative interviews that Transport for the North present in their report. And basically, if you've got long journeys, they're very arduous, they're very time-consuming, this has an impact on people's ability to work, therefore people's ability to have a decent standard of living, as well as issues around increased exposure to pollution and traffic risks, because they're more reliant on walking in areas where walking is not optimal. So basically, overall, thinking about the impacts of poor transport and land use integration, we see that there is an impact of reduced wealth, health and social well-being. And I think that this is the sort of lens that we now need to start probing our transport policies through, is this integrative idea about whether people can support their livelihoods, have a good quality of healthy life, and have a good social well-being in the context of the current land use and transport system that we are developing. I don't really want to go into this diagram in any great sense, but I think what I want to try and say with it is that there is a difference between transport disadvantage and social disadvantage, and somewhere in the middle is an idea about transport poverty. So not everybody who's transport disadvantaged will necessarily be transport poor, and not everyone who's socially disadvantaged will necessarily be transport poor. And it is very much about this idea of accessibility and inaccessibility, which leads to a lack of opportunity, as well as a lack of physical access to goods and services, and that this is a reinforcing, self-reinforcing system and cycle, which we have to break through both the economic and political structures that we have, the governance and decision frameworks that we have, and also thinking about people's ideas of what's normal to expect from the transport system, and how much is it normal for low-income people who can barely afford to feed their children to have to rely on cars for their transport services, and to break some of these ideas of social acceptability. So I want to just very quickly talk about a project that I was working on, which has tried to take an integrated social impacts approach to the evaluation of transport systems. And it's the Lower Thames Crossing project, which is quite controversial, a road project that runs through some communities in the southeast of England. This is the route, and it basically cuts through a large amount of rural areas, but it also goes through some quite densely populated urban areas as well. So a social assessment was seen as necessary. And this is, again, a complex diagram, but what we were trying to do with the study was to wrap up a whole load of requirements on the evaluators of these projects, so that we could come up with a consolidated community impacts report on how the road would affect local communities. And we use a baseline example of how the current conditions and the profile of local communities, think about the potential effects of traffic on the local area if nothing is done. Then look at what would happen with the intervention of the road, and look at how that any negative impacts might be mitigated, and then look at the possible benefits to those communities once mitigation has taken place. The baseline data thinks, on the one hand, about populations and the different distribution of the population in terms of their socio-demographic characteristics. It also thinks about things like health, community infrastructures, current modes of transport, and so on, and accessibility to services. We're particularly thinking about access to work, training and education, but also to community infrastructures, but also thinking about the impacts on air quality, noise, cycling and walking, road safety, and more unusually thinking about how people's social networks might be affected, how communities might be affected and broken up or negatively displaced in terms of housing. So quite a lot of different issues to think about in terms of how the communities are affected. This is just an example of the indicator framework, but being very clear that we have indicators that measure things quantitatively, but also we have indicators that have to go and speak to people qualitatively. Basically then mapping the different impacts against the different communities. So thinking about where the deprived communities are and how different impacts will affect deprived communities, for example, or different age communities. Thinking about that in terms of the proximal communities, but also the wider region and how people are affected across the 6 local authorities that are going to, the road is going to go through. And then thinking, for example, about, well, what's the pathway to each of these different impacts? So if, for example, there is severance, then how will that disrupt walkers and cyclists and so on, both in the construction and operation phases of the project? I don't want to go too much into this, but you can look at this on the slides. But the point being is that as well as doing what is common in these projects, which is to measure this using largely publicly available data sets and GIS mapping, we also went and spoke to communities, particularly vulnerable communities, to try and understand how the project would affect their daily lives and their travel behaviours. And it was quite interesting because there were very big differences between the low-income populations that didn't usually participate in public consultation and the public consultation respondees who were predominantly older male retirees. And again, I don't want to go too much into this, but I think one of the big problems was that it was very difficult to get data to be able to do these analyses in GIS. And in fact, what was needed was more bespoke local survey data, and that's not a part of the current evaluation framework for road projects or any other project for that matter. So I think more data collection is really needed in order to get to this person-centre metrics, which were not being recorded, and also this issue of how to record the cumulative impacts on communities, people and places. So when the same communities are being impacted by multiple problems such as air quality, reduced accessibility, increased severance, how that has an overall effect on those communities rather than an individual effect. So I just think that when we're making decisions, there is an inherent link between the transport system and how different social outcomes are affected, and that there's always winners and losers from new projects. So we have to do this social assessment to decide who do we want to benefit and get away from this idea that we can deliver policies that benefit all, and that we might want to move towards this idea of transport justice with a social progress approach. Transport justice is also more than about just this evaluation approach, though. We really need to have agreements around whether we have minimum standards in terms of accessibility, for example, to services, whether we want to measure our performance continuously against these spatial, social and social inequalities, and thinking about people's basic activity needs and how we deliver restorative justice projects and programs to reduce inequalities of outcome, because at the moment we don't actually measure how our policies are doing that. Merely we tend to look at where the current inequalities are, but not how new projects are performing in terms of reducing those inequalities. And I think that although the approach I'm talking about is predominantly at the moment about transport infrastructure evaluation, it could equally be applied to policies and programs as well. For example, the decarbonisation programme. So this is a book that myself and very many people have contributed chapters to. It's all about trying to measure transport equity using lots of different methods and methodologies. I can recommend it as a go-to reference title, and hopefully, yeah, I've kept to time.
Yes, absolutely. Many thanks, Karen, for fascinating talk. I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, but I know I have at least one question, and my colleague Tom Jarvis does as well. So I'll start with mine. I just wanted to ask, I suppose, about the particularly with the political environment now, and the pressure to deliver infrastructure projects as rapidly as possible to realise economic benefits primarily. I'm just wondering if you could comment on how that can be reconciled with really getting this much more granular understanding of the impact of transport projects and ensuring that the assessments are vigorous and that we do everything properly. I mean, are they reconcilable, or do we just need to go make sure that we do things properly, and that might mean going slower? What would you say on that?
I think that actually the whole social and distributional impact assessment of infrastructure projects is incredibly long-winded and very overburdensome. And that actually, for example, Transport for the North could do something to do a much easier, quicker evaluation of the projects that are being put forward to see how they would impact on different communities in a much shorter time frame and much more cost efficiently, without having to go down the whole consultants full-on SDI appraisal route. And I think that that's something that could be really recommended, that you did a sort of social exclusion analysis or an equity analysis of the entire programme and all the projects, and not wait for the individual projects to go through that SDI appraisal process. That would be my recommendation, because I think that certain projects are clearly there solely for economic reasons. And it's very clear that a lot of those projects are not very equitable in terms of the distribution of their outcome. And so we're talking the talk of equity, but not walking the walk of it. And the trouble is with these systems is that they live for 100 years. So we build in that inequity further and further for another 100 years, So it is important to get in there right at the inception of these projects and do some analyses that may not be as rigorous and as long-winded as the full SDI appraisal, but do give you a real clear indicator about who benefits, who disbenefits, and what the likely impacts are at that sort of socio-spatial level.
Very thought-provoking and great answer. Thanks for that, Karen. I think Tom Jarvis also had a question, but please do put anything in the Q&A, if anything, if you'd like to ask Karen anything as well.
And just to say, I have to go, so if anyone does want to ask me a question, it's now or never.
I'll happily take up that opportunity for now and ever, if that's okay, Karen. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very interested in the differences that you briefly mentioned between what came out through the formal consultation and what was uncovered through your qualitative work. And just to link to a bit of work that TFN is currently undertaking, we're proposing to develop a social inclusion checklist to support early business case development, both at the programme and potentially at the project level. I just wondered if you could highlight anything in the book that you mentioned that might be particularly useful to inform that development process.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of stuff in there about detailed modelling and case studies of projects, but there are the basic principles of what you might want to measure and the indicators that you might want to use up front. And this idea of a sort of principles of social progress and livelihoods and well-being, there's quite a bit of that in the book, which I think is a good aggregating sort of concept for how transport is affecting different people and places. So that might be useful for you. But I think for me, the big thing that came out was the difference between when we did the qualitative data, we were coming with a lot more local issues around the design of the project, and people were bringing up whole new issues because perhaps they were walking kids to school, or they were older and disabled and they couldn't get across roads. So it was bringing a lot of the nuances out. Whether you can do that up front before the project's been designed is a bit of a question, but we're trying at the moment to do a sort of prospective, how do you think the projects will affect you, and how do they affect your priorities and so forth, through focus group research. And I think focus groups are a quite efficient way of engaging, especially with harder to reach groups. So that would be sort of a recommendation, Tom, to try and build some of that in. The surveys, and particularly the public consultations, just don't reach those people. You have to go out and get them where they are. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, it certainly does. So thank you very much for that.
So I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. And given I know you've come out of another meeting, Karen, please feel free to leave. But many thanks for joining us. It's been fascinating. We will now move over to Jiang from ITS Leeds, talking about quite a specific area and noise, and that is noise impacts, which I know Karen touched on, but I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail. So over to you, Like.
I'll share my screen.
Yes,
see that. Okay. First, thank you to Jack and Tom for inviting me here. I'm a research fellow at Institute for Transport Studies, University of Leeds. Today I'm going to talk about transport noise impact at home and beyond, now and in future, which covers the work I've been doing over the past few years. I'll first quickly go through some quick facts of transport noise impact, and then following noise impact at non-residential locations, and wanted sounds and soundscape. And then I'll talk about social spatial distribution of transport noise, which I think Karen covered a bit in her presentation. And finally, I'll talk about the transport electrification and the noise. So first, some quick facts. Transport is the dominant source of environmental noise. The overall number of people in Europe exposed to day, evening, night noise levels of 55 dB or above is estimated to be 113 million for road traffic noise, 22 million for railway noise, and 4 million for aircraft noise. The 55 dB is the threshold value defined by WHO, above which noise can cause adverse effects. It was estimated that about 15% of the population in urban area in the UK and in Europe were exposed to road noise above this level. Exposure to noise can cause problems such as sleep disturbance, annoyance, cardiovascular disease, cognitive impairment, and so on. And there are less addressed impacts on other than impact on human health. There are some other impact that's like wildlife, urban rail, cultural heritage has been less addressed. Not everyone exposed to noise above the threshold level will be annoyed, disturbed, or experience health impact, but the percentage gets higher as the noise level goes higher. This is a result from a plastic study. I think WHO used this to define their guidance. So here we can see it's the percentage of people slightly annoyed, and highly annoyed as a function of the day, evening, night noise level. If we look at here, So about 10% of people will feel highly annoyed when exposed to the 55 dB threshold level, and about 20% will feel annoyed. So almost 20 million Europeans are annoyed by noise, 8 million suffer from sleep disturbance, 43,000 hospital administration per year, and 10,000 premature death per year caused by noise. And transport noise is the second largest environmental threat to public health in the Western Europe. These values are likely to be underestimated because the estimation did not comprehensively cover all urban areas or all roads across Europe. Here is the marginal values road noise per dB per household per year used for transport appraisal in England in 2014 price. If we look at the right-hand side here, cost of 1 dB increase from 79 dB to 80 dB is close to £100 per year for a typical household, which is quite high. Annual cost of road noise in England was estimated to be 7 to 10 billion, which is very close to the cost of accidents. Such noise evaluation too is very helpful, so noise impacts can be monetized and included in transport appraisal. But these values only consider noise impact at residential locations, as well as the statistics we saw in the previous slide. They only account for the impact people experience at home. And we know there are also noise impact at some other locations like schools, office, hospitals, park, urban square, and so on. But there isn't much standardization on how these impacts should be assessed and valued. We will have a look at this issue. So, valuing noise impacts at non-residential locations. Let's have a look at a case study, a pedestrianisation scheme in Otley. This is not a real project, but a hypothetical one. And the project would remove cars from Market Street here, which is a busy marketplace here, which is a busy market street. Currently has mixed use for cars, pedestrian, and other activities. Some of you might have been there. Nice place. So following current guidance, this is how noise impact of such a project would be assessed and appraised. So we first have noise impact assessment result, which tell us where and how much noise will change and who will be affected. We can see many of the shops, cafe, restaurant, and the open market, and also some residential properties are currently exposed to quite high road noise. And if the pedestrianisation project goes ahead, they will enjoy quite a lot of noise reduction benefit. But however, using the current appraisal method in WebTag, only noise reduction at these blue residential properties will be monetized and included, and the noise reduction benefit at all the other locations will quite likely be underestimated or just ignored in appraisal. There are, of course, the regulations and the guidance on noise at non-residential locations. As we can see, two examples here, one in Scotland and one used in US. They cover locations like schools, hospitals, parks, but they are not very standardized or detailed. And more importantly, there's little research on valuing noise impact at these locations, and hence it is currently very difficult to include them quantitatively and equally in appraisal. We made more discussion on this topic in our paper published in Applied Acoustics, and you may have a look if you're interested. Another issue with current noise appraisal is, as the word noise indicates, it only focuses on unwanted sound. However, there are also sounds that are pleasant or we want to hear at certain time and at certain locations. For an urban square, wanted sounds can be sounds of footsteps, chats, street performance, children playing. The square would otherwise sound dead or only has traffic noise. And here the wall with running water outside Sheffield Railway Station. I think many of you have been there. The wall not only block and mitigate sound noise from the road, but the sound of running water is pleasant to hear, and it also masks the sounds from the road. And there are also sounds from the nature, from the wildlife, like bird sound, which is always pleasant to hear and have health benefit. So there are a lot of sounds around us, not just noise. And over the past 2 decades, there has been an ongoing paradigm shift from noise control to soundscape design. Soundscape, by definition, is the acoustic environment as perceived or experienced or understood by a person or people in context. So the approach considers sounds as potential resource rather than just waste or pollution. There are already ISO standards on soundscape definition, data collection and analysis, and in 2018 the Welsh government became the first national government in the world to officially adopt soundscape by referring to soundscape in the title and throughout their noise and soundscape action plan. But so far the soundscape approach hasn't been very much considered in transport noise assessment or transport appraisal. So benefit of these wanted sounds or positive soundscapes are mostly ignored in transport appraisal. Another problem is there's currently little research on soundscape valuation. So we don't know how much values these positive sounds hold, or how much people would be willing to pay to have them or to keep them. So we wouldn't be able to develop the noise valuation we just seen used in McTigue to assign a monetary value to these positive sounds in appraisal. We recently published a paper on this topic and discussed data and method issues about soundscape valuation. So you may have a look if you're interested. Now let's talk about the social spatial distribution of transport noise. Here are maps of road noise and deprivation of an area in Leeds. This is the Leeds Ring Road, this one here, which is quite a noisy one. It is common to see that area exposed to high noise level are more deprived than nearby areas. We cannot infer a causal relationship simply from a correlation, but I think we can be confident to say that deprived areas are more likely to suffer from noise. I did some simple analysis on social distribution of rail noise. I chose rail noise because I think more people will travel by rail in the future, because rail is a very green mode with much lower carbon emission compared to road and air transport. But rail will also cause noise impacts. As we can see here, those who live very close to the railway line, noise level can be quite high. But on the other hand, with more people traveling, shifting from car to rail, there might be less road noise. But this is beyond the scope of discussion today. We just focus on road noise for now, rail noise for now. Different from road transport, being close to a railway line doesn't necessarily mean you have good access to rail service. It's all about proximity to rail stations. So those houses I showed here are actually just next to a rail station. So although they suffer from rail noise, they do benefit from good access to rail service. But how many houses are close to railway line but far from stations, and who are living there? I did a simple analysis to explore the answer. So there are about 32,000 LSOAs in England. I calculated how many of them are exposed to above 55 dB rail noise. Under the column stations here means the LSOAs are within 800-meter radius of a station, which means they have good access to rail service, and the corridor column means they are outside the 800 radius, so they don't really have good access to rail service. So here's the result. About 1.2% of the population are exposed to rail noise, and most of them are within 800-meter radius of a station. And there doesn't seem to have a strong pattern of deprivation distribution among these exposed groups. We might say slightly those exposed to rail noise while at the same time quite close to a station are slightly more deprived, because it has darker green color here, which is the more deprived population. Things are a bit different if we focus on London. As we can see from the bar here, people who are exposed to rail noise but live far from a station seem to be more deprived. There's a higher percentage of people in the deprived category. For the rest of England, what I found interesting is the number of exposed people in the corridor area and in the station area are quite close, which means about half of the people exposed to rail noise do not actually have good access to rail service. I didn't do the analysis for TFN area because it was done quite a while ago, but it would be interesting to see the pattern in TFN area. Now let's talk about transport electrification and noise. So rail is not the only green transport we want to have more in the future. Electrification will also play a big role in transport decarbonisation, and its noise reduction benefit have received much less attention. So how electrification reduce noise? As we can see from the chart here, road noise mainly can include engine noise, which is the red line here, and tire noise, which is the green line here. For typical internal combustion engine cars, engine noise dominates below about 30 km/h, while tire noise dominates above about 50 km/h. So EV engines are very quiet, so the total noise will be low in low speed areas. If we remove the red line here, which is what can happen with EV, no engine noise. So anything below this speed will be quite quiet. So EV can be quite quiet in city centers and in residential areas. What would be even better is moving from cars to e-bikes, which have almost no noise at all. However, the noise reduction benefit is usually not included in life cycle assessment of EVs or e-bikes, partly because there are methodological complications. We try to include it in our study of life cycle assessment, comparing petrol car, EV, and e-bike. We used a busy A road in Leeds, A61 as the case study area, and designed 3 scenarios. The petrol car scenario, where all cars are petrol cars. The EV scenarios, where all cars are electric cars. And the e-bike scenario, where cars commuting under 5 miles are replaced by e-bikes. The results show that in the electric car scenario, disability adjusted life years caused by noise can be reduced by 8.3%, and in the e-bike scenario by 3.4%. The method has mainly this result could be quite a larger reduction benefit if scale up to a whole city or a whole population. If we think about how many people, this blue dot means population, people living along the road. So if we scale up to a whole city or whole country, it will benefit a lot of population. And the method has many limitations, but I think it's a nice first attempt, and hopefully we will see many improvements in the future. Okay, so this is what I want to present today. So it's covered quite a lot of different topics within the overall topic of noise. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, BK, for that fascinating talk. We do have one question in the chat, so I'll just read that out. It's from Magda. She asks, so noise modelling is quite expensive to procure for each project and is then restricted to that project in terms of assumptions and impact area dependent. So is there open source data and processes that can be used in the analysis for the appraisal that you would recommend?
So we can't see can we see the question actually? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I see the question now. Yeah, it is very expensive, especially if you want to do a very large scale. So most of the noise mapping software I used, you need to purchase license, they're professional ones, but there are open source noise mapping software, and I know there's researchers are continually developing these tools and making them available, but still these are still quite data heavy. You do need it's garbage in, garbage out. The better data you have, better result you have, and also the open source. I would say the calculations is a bit simplified because if you want to run the calculation with don't have good enough hardware. It can be, yeah. Overall, it is still quite expensive if you want to get really high quality result. I would say it's a compromise, a trade-off for what kind of result you want and what you want to use the result for. Hope this answer your question.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, but I have one myself. So I think you touched on it in the presentation, but certainly in your paper, you talk about kind of the improvements in the in analytical techniques, in data collection techniques in particular, for measuring public exposure to noise in public spaces, and you talk about new crowdsourcing methods for obtaining that data. I was just wondering if you could touch on that, as it sounds like a really interesting area of development in the field.
Yeah, this I think it's a few years ago, some researchers in Germany, they were doing so they developed apps where people can upload the sound or the noise level at certain locations that they found interesting or they want to share with the community. So that's because otherwise, if you it's very expensive for a researcher to cover all the locations across a city. So it's better to engage the community to collect all this noise or sound information for the researcher and for the community themselves. Yeah. So and also because the noise mapping software, like we mentioned, it can only predict or map noise. It cannot map where there are bird sound, where there are running water, fountain sound. This is the noise mapping cannot do. So people are talking about soundscape mapping, which it can be achieved in two ways. One is somehow we develop prediction algorithm based on land use data and based on land cover and the land cover data, we predict and map the soundscape across the whole city. Or we use the crowdsourcing method. We have people to measure the sound in situ, and then collectively we produce a sound map for a whole city. Yeah, but this is not what I myself has been doing. So, yeah, this is, and also I think there are sometimes on social media like Twitter, you can filter out those tweets that mention the sounds at specific locations, and this is also another way to use crowdsourcing data to measure or to map the sound in a city or in a region. Okay.
Thanks for that. Great answer. Yeah, I really enjoyed that talk. I hope others did as well. It's an area that's often neglected, but there's a lot to consider, particularly in terms of the impact of changes like the EV transition and potential mode shift to rail, and what impact that will have, and the distributional impact that will have on noise impact. So I really appreciate that you coming along and giving that talk. We will now move on to Joe McTigue. I'll just check he's still in the. Yes, you're still there. Brilliant. So thank you, Like. Joe, you are now live.
Thanks, Jack. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Good stuff. Afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you should be able to see the slides there. Jack, it's the last question I'll ask you.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, well, delighted to be invited along today, and I hope you'll all find this an interesting set of slides. There's some really interesting research findings to present today, but also I wanted to include some extra information on how some of the findings have been used to inform Northern's ongoing strategy, evidence base, and decision making. So I think there's probably something here for everyone. I was assuming a mix of researchers, analysts and policy people who might be listening into this. So hopefully there's a bit of something for everyone here. I'll go through the main findings first, and then happy to take any questions at the end. So hopefully that works for everyone. Okay, so this is what I'm proposing to go through. Firstly, just setting the background and the context, both for the study we've done, but also how that fits into our wider work here at Northern. To go through the methodology, I'll do this in there's a lot to get through, so I'll go through that fairly briefly, but can obviously follow up afterwards as needs be. Onto the key findings, and I think people on the call will find that interesting. And then I just want to touch on what are we actually doing with all this information? How is it feeding into our decision making and ongoing processes? So we'll pick that up at the end and almost bring it to life really in terms of, well, what can we further do to improve our economic, social, environmental contributions in the North? And as I say, happy to take any questions at the end or follow up offline as needs be. So in terms of the background, I think it's worth saying that sort of Northern and its predecessors have always been aware of the contribution we make to the economy, society, environment in the North. This isn't a hugely new thing, and also always looking for how we further enhance those things. I think one thing I would say is that maybe we haven't shouted about it in the past, possibly as much as we could have done. Maybe you could argue that for the rail sector more generally as well. When Northern came under DOHL ownership in March 2020, it did give us the opportunity to be more explicit about this and actually take a step back and work out how do we further enhance our contribution to the North in all its different ways. As I said, the economy, environment, society, and there's a range of different levers and ways we can actually do that. Included in that, there's a range of things we've set out for the organisation overall to do to enhance our contribution to the North, but we've also set up a specific team, a strategic planning function to actually, as it says on the slide there, enhance the evidence base, look at how we further this agenda, and also work more fully with partners to just how we maximise Northern's impact in the North. It's worth just being aware of just the type of scale we're talking about here before we get on to how you measure this. And sometimes it's not always, people aren't always clear on just how big an institution, how big a company Northern is. So, it depends on the measure you use, but by some measures, we're actually the largest train company in the country. That includes number of stations and amount of vehicle miles. But certainly the largest company in the north of England. 2/3 of rail journeys in the north on our services, at least 1 million passengers a day, supporting 21 community rail partnerships, serving 500 stations. So there is some serious scale here. Also, one of the things I'll come on to is the jobs we support, but it's worth saying we're one of the largest employers in the north as well. So even before we start, it's quite clear that there's a lot of impact to try and get our heads around here. What there is fairly limited, was fairly limited evidence as what sort of value all these effects have. A number of people on the call will be aware that there's been a lot of studies in the past looking to assess different types of economic value. What we wanted to do with this one was actually look at all the different types of effects we have and try and do it in the most holistic way possible. So working with a very good team at Atkins, set about that shortly after lockdown, which was just an interesting dynamic to bear in mind as I go through some of the findings. So most of our main findings are focused on the last year pre-March 2020, but actually lots of the work and various other aspects was undertaken in periods of lockdown, which introduced quite an interesting dynamic. It also just explains why we've actually sort of launched this in a series of incremental steps. Most of our launch events have tended to be postponed, so it's been more events like this and a few other events that partners may have seen us at, where we've been spreading the word about some of our work in this space. But we'll continue to do that. So this slide sets out the different components. This is where it'll get a bit technical, so apologies for any non-techies on the call, but I'll try and explain all this in as layman's terms as possible. I mentioned that what the study tried to do is actually look at all the different types of effect that Northern has, and then actually measure each of these. And it's worth saying that each of these tends to use quite a different modelling approach. So I'll go through these, as I say, relatively briefly. To start off with, in terms of jobs and gross value added supported. So I mentioned on the previous slide, Northern is one of the largest employers in the north of England, employing almost 7,000 staff directly. Due to the wages we pay, there's straight away an impact on gross value added in the north, which can then be measured and a value put to. Similarly, our supply chain spending, again, we know what we spend and we know what's spent in the north of England. We can derive GVA estimates from that and also factor in multiplier effects for follow-on rounds of spend, and get to some pretty accurate figures in terms of just our contribution to the economy in the north in that sense. And then there's what are the benefits for passengers, what are the benefits for society. To actually be able to generate these, and this is where some of you steeped in rail modelling expertise will smile, because the task here was to essentially compare the Northern network as is to if Northern didn't exist as a network or didn't exist as an operator, which is an interesting methodological task, which I'm more than happy to follow up on with people if interested. I mean, the main points to basically pick out are we're looking to compare the current benefits that passengers on the network as is have compared to if Northern didn't exist, and that's in terms of both journey time savings in terms of passenger benefits, but also benefits for society from essentially less cars on the road, so reduced road congestion and other environmental benefits. Other types of effects that were measured, so contribution to agglomeration, some of the time savings I've already mentioned can then feed into further models, which essentially, I'm sure most people on the call are aware of the theories of agglomeration and how increased density basically lead to increased economic performance. So what's rail's role in terms of contributing to that? There's a series of effects, and I was really interested in the previous presentation actually on noise in areas not close to rail stations. This is arguably looking at the opposite effect. So what's the value that residents who don't necessarily use the train, but what value do they place on living close to a network or living close to a train station? And these values vary by type of station or type of population, but essentially it's possible to value living in reasonably close proximity, what value you put on that. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation to have in terms of how that looks compared to some of the noise disbenefits that were discussed on the earlier presentation. And the last effect that was measured is almost looking to capture a total economic value or certainly a minimum value, where essentially the two things that were summed were the value of passengers' time on the trains, and also the value of the fares paid, and sum those, which I'll come on to in a second how that looks, and essentially try and get a proxy for that must be at least the value of the journey to them, otherwise there'd be no incentive for them to make the trip. So I'm conscious that's a whistle-stop tour in terms of all of the different types of effects and benefits that the study measured. So I'll give people a chance to draw their breath, and then I'll just go through the findings of those. So I hope that's made sense. I've tried to dumb that down as much as possible, but it's, yeah, there's some behind each approach. Essentially, there's a set of analytical approaches that help derive the end figures. So I hope if there's no other takeaways, there's a certain model behind each set of analysis, essentially. And the next two slides look at just what some of the findings look like from the study. And I mean, I think in headline terms, it's worth saying that Northern as an operator does derive some significant benefits for the north of England. I mean, when you start to talk about jobs, it's almost 11,000 overall, and quite a significant contribution to gross value added in the north. The benefits to passengers, also benefits to society, are pretty sizable. And I mean, the nature of our network, there's lots of rural routes, so maybe you'd expect not that much contribution to economic mass, but there certainly is a contribution, largely in more urban areas. And also there is a fairly significant value put on people actually living in reasonably close proximity to stations. And again, there's a set of value there. I think the 1.25 billion, I mentioned just before how that figure's derived in terms of the combination of the value of people's time on the network and also the fare they pay. I mean, that gets to a figure of 1.25 billion annually, which we've done some further work, and that averages about £15 per trip on average. It's quite interesting when you look at it, because if you look at some of the visitor economy surveys that are undertaken and other pieces of work that look at different types of spending in a day, quite often you can get figures of at least double that amount, and that's before you try and factor in people who use the train to get to work and the value they'd put on that. So one of the areas we're interested in doing more work actually is, if you look at the actual value supported by the Northern network, there's a reasonable case to say it's much more than 1.25 billion, and that is very much a minimum figure. Actually, colleagues from Transport for the North on the call, it's a conversation we've had with those guys, and I'm sure we'll continue looking to develop that, because it does feel like an underestimate when you think about all the reasons people might use the train. This slide just reinforces the message from the previous slide, but it's worth just setting out the reason for putting this up as well is we've set the impacts alongside. I mean, the Northern as operator receives a certain amount of subsidy from government to run its services, which in the last year pre-lockdowns was 500 million. And one of the points of the study was to say that, I mean, one of the things the study didn't do was try and add all the different effects up and come to one big figure. And there's an interesting conversation about what might you sum between all the different types of effects, but it kept them largely separate. But whichever way you cut it, each of these comfortably outweigh the costs to the taxpayer of actually running Northern. So, I mean, as you might imagine, it's a quite a big message to policymakers that, being as robust as we can in each way of actually looking at this, the benefits outweigh the costs of having Northern in the north of England. And this is without all of the other, types of effect that are just, more difficult to measure. So, again, in terms of quick takeaways from today, if you take nothing else away, this slide's going to look at just in terms of all the different types of benefit we generate are significant and comfortably outweigh the cost of what it takes to run Northern as an operator. I'm conscious that's been quite a technical section there. I mean, I'm depending on what you think, Jack. If there's any questions, sorry, I can't see the chat. I'm more than happy to pause there if there's any technical questions or reflections on the research. If not, I'll go straight on to what what we've essentially done with these findings and what it means for our strategy and decision making.
Yeah, I don't see any technical questions in the chat, so feel free to go on with the next slides.
Yeah, that's fine, and I'll apologise if I've sort of blown people's minds a little bit. It's been 10 minutes on, some quite, as I say, in-depth modelling of different types of rail benefits, but hopefully it's made sense to everyone on the call in terms of what I've been through.
Sorry, Joe, I spoke too soon. We just had one question in the chat about the breakdown of benefits that you mentioned across society. I don't know if you could briefly touch on anything in the study that looks at that and the different groups impacted.
It's in terms of sort of further breakdowns of what's on the screen now.
Yes.
So I mean, as you'd imagine, lots of these effects do break down in different ways, whether that's spatially or whether that's, and actually that's reminding me, I have got a couple of slides coming up in terms of spatial distribution. I think I would argue, which I'll come on to, and I think you find this quite interesting because pretty much all the data on this does disaggregate different sub-geographies across the north of England. I think in terms of other groups, I mean, it would be possible to further break some of these effects down as well, although arguably, the group, the passengers versus non-passengers versus people who live near stations and, do give a certain amount of disaggregation anyway. In terms of where these different types of effects accrue to, as I say, all of these can be broken down. I've got a couple of examples on the following maps. This is the direct effect. So, I mean, essentially, this is showing where all the northern workers are based and the GVA that derives from their workplace. I mean, as you probably expect, it largely follows a pattern of where our principal either depots, stations, and other sort of locations of staff are based. But you do see, as you might guess, in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, York, how basically where the GVA is generated in terms of where our staff are located. That's when, and that does break down by different types of staff as well. One of the advantages of all the data sets in this is that they do break down in different ways. Just the last one on spatial distribution. This is indirect impact. So this is essentially where our supply chain is principally located. As you probably guess, a few big suppliers do generate a lot of this. So the Red in Manchester, for example, has a few key suppliers there. There's a lot of suppliers do explain some of the different sort of darker colours on the map as well. But as I say, in terms of the overall question, whether it's spatially or for different groups, they have been disaggregated in a lot of different ways and can be further as needed. I mean, one of the questions at the end might be for any partners on the call, which of this information might be useful for them in terms of their own work. What might we either help with or advise on? So hopefully that's given a reasonable answer for now.
That's great. Thanks, Joe.
Okay. If there's no other sort of technical questions, or for now anyway, I'll just come on to the so what bit. And as I said at the start, I mean, this whole wider agenda of how does Northern make a greater contribution to the North in terms of economic, social, environmental, the type of contribution we can make. There's a range of things happening which this study has really been a catalyst for. So I'll just briefly run through some of these. I mean, in terms of our procurement here, I mean, many partners on the call will be aware that the 2012 Sustainable Development Social Value Act gave a steer in terms of procurement anyway, but we've been further looking to develop that in terms of making sure our procurement fully supports businesses in the North, environmental outcomes, other societal outcomes, and that's a task we're continuing to develop. In terms of timetable planning, I mean, lots of people on the call be aware that's had significant discussion recently, although it's an ongoing area of discussion. Lots of the types of intelligence and ways of disaggregating it feed in on an ongoing basis to our planning the timetable. So whether it's understanding things about options for different timetable options, or just what actual value a route brings, or what some of the station catchments look like, and what the value is to localities of having different timetable options. That's one of the big things we feed in now as part of our ongoing, just informing how Northern operates. Many partners will be aware of stations as a place. There's a whole area of work in terms of how we better use stations commercially, but also for the benefit of partners as well, whether it's for community groups and other groups. So you'll start to see in a number of stations, but it's being rolled out across the network, things like Amazon lockers, things like greater use of commercial space, whether for retail or also just to host businesses. What more we could do with local community groups with station buildings. So there's a whole area of work around just how do we drive more value from stations. Many of you will be aware of the RSSB Social Value Toolkit. Northern's adopted this and is currently reporting on this, which the first outputs of that report should be later this year. It's worth saying, how does that tie in with the study we just talked about? Well, lots of the indicators in that will form part of our wider social value reporting. So some of the economic values, increased environmental values, and also some of our other sort of societal values are all being brought together in one annual report. You may have seen other train companies and others produce these already, but we've committed to doing the same. We've got a net zero strategy, and that's looking across the Northern business at all the different ways we can both reduce carbon and have other positive environmental effects. And we've also done a range of modelling to actually how we can even achieve, if 2040 is a target for getting towards net zero for Northern or for the sector, for example, how is it even possible to get there? One of the big ways is through our rolling stock strategy, which is something we're working on at the moment. So basically assessing all of our different fleet and looking at what's going to be needed, both in terms of decarbonisation, but also in terms of all the other requirements of the network over the next 20, 30 years. And how do we essentially both decarbonise and ensure the optimum train fleet we need? I think it's worth just saying on that, and again, this is something we're more than happy to follow up with partners at a later date. It feels like producing business cases for rolling stock is a fairly emerging discipline, and it's an area where we're doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of really capturing the benefits and being able to model those of different types of rolling stock. So it's something, again, very happy to have a discussion with any interested partners as a follow-up. And just generally in terms of both our business plan and other appraisal criteria, and just also how we monitor and evaluate projects and what benefits they bring. Again, this is all ongoing work for us at the moment, which is all of this has really come from both being set up to do some of this and these being set as business priorities following March 2020, but also, as I say, the study we've had has really given us a catalyst to go and really push on some of these agendas. Last slide, then I'll pause. It's worth saying, and I think this is just the last point really in terms of the level of evidence to feed into all these areas. Lots of the types of effects in the study now we're basically maintaining lots of the models, so we can actually report on different aspects and keep them up to date whenever needed. We've also, in parallel to that, just been ensuring we continue to enhance the rest of our evidence base. I won't read all the slides out there, but essentially making sure that each either decision that Northern's directly making or where we're working with partners, we've got the best possible sets of tools to actually derive economic, environmental, social benefits and make sure they feed into whether it's a business case, a strategy or anything else that's needed. And really make sure we are a centre of excellence for the region in rail evidence, rail analysis. I mean, many partners who listen to this are working with us anyway, or certainly know of us. And I mean, very happy to further have conversations, share data, anything we can do to assist partners, as well as, further present on what we set out today. I feel like I've talked a lot there. I hope I'm about okay for time. Very happy to take questions, comments, or, as I say, follow up at a later date if that's useful.
Many thanks, Joe. Great talk, and really appreciated the report and the comprehensive approach that you took to looking at the impact of Northern. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A for now, but again, I have a question for you, which is, I know in the report you touch on kind of looking at what the impact of COVID is likely to be over the medium and longer term, and you write about 2022 to 25 as a period of kind of where new commuter patterns would stabilise, where we'd see increased leisure travel. A lot of this is now coming into fruition. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on kind of the continued value of rail in light of the changes we've seen since the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I mean, this in some ways, this is the $1 million question, really, isn't it? Because to rail and to public transport generally, clearly the pandemic and clearly lockdowns, have posed a big challenge in recent years. That I don't think there's any getting away from that. And we as a business, I mean, if you go back to lots of the outcomes that are set out before, lots of those do accrue to passengers and people using the network. So when you get a threat to what we do, like the pandemic and like the lockdowns that follow, it's been a major challenge for us and for the sector. So I mean, one of the big ways, and we've debated this internally for a while, about driving the types of value that I've set out already, is how we do a combination of encouraging people to use the network and encouraging people back onto trains. More generally, also how we continue to work with partners to both optimise the network, how we can enhance the network. There's proposals for new stations and other routes across the network as well. How we have ongoing discussions about the current network and how that's optimised. So that's a slightly long-winded way of saying priority one for us is, there's the obvious priorities about running the best train service possible, but how we continue to recover after COVID, and when we might get back to something like pre-March 2020 are the killer questions, really, because it's almost like further value is added from every service we run, every passenger we carry. So if you had to pick out one priority, how we just keep increasing that and getting back to what we were is one of our biggest challenges.
Great, thanks for that. Really interesting answer, and still obviously a lot of uncertainty, but I'm sure it's very encouraging, the figures that we see in terms of passenger numbers, particularly for leisure travel in the north, and how leisure is a particularly important segment in the north of England compared to other regions. It's all very interesting.
Absolutely, and this is it, and it's some of the patterns pre-pandemic, as you say, have changed for now quite fundamentally. So what value that drives, and where I mentioned before about getting underneath some of the figures, and actually there's a whole set of questions around what value do leisure travellers drive versus commuting passengers, and also passengers who use the network for other things, whether it's for to get to school or to get to a hospital or other type service. There's a whole set of different reasons people use the train, which were there anyway, but have further changed over the past sort of 2.5 years, which we're still trying to both understand and work out what that's going to mean for demand, and then the value that follows from that.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff. I don't see anything else coming up in the Q&A. If anyone has any last minute things to add, then now's your time. But otherwise, it was really great having you hear Joe and all the other speakers. It's been a great session, and as I said, this session's been live cast and also recorded, so I'm sure lots of people who haven't been able to attend, given it's been through the lunch break, will watch afterwards and may well get in touch with you and other speakers, Joe, afterwards. So many thanks.
That's fine. Just last quick thing on the slides, which if you circulate the slides, there's a link to the report and some of the background findings from that. There's a link to our stakeholder hub, which has got lots of other useful partner information, and I'm pretty sure my email address is on there as well. So more than happy for people to get in touch if useful.
Brilliant. Again, thanks a lot, and I will now close the session. I'll just finally add that, as I said, this is a quarterly event. So our next academic forum, I believe the date has yet to be confirmed, but it will probably be in January, and we'll keep everyone updated on that. If you're signed up via Eventbrite, you'll hear about that session, and look forward to seeing you, many of you there. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.